From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. The big story of the day, at least one of them, is trade. The United States and China have agreed to a Phase 1 trade deal. President Trump says the Chinese have agreed to structural changes in agricultural purchases. China says the United States will be rolling back tariffs, at least in stages or phases. Here to take us through it all is Sean Donnan of Bloomberg News. You're the person I want to talk to, Sean, because the more I've heard about this, the less I understand it. Exactly what do we think they have agreed and haven't they agreed?
Well, they have nailed down the text, and it's now going to the lawyers, and that deal calls for 4 big elements. The first of them is a big ramping up of Chinese agricultural purchases. Before the trade wars, they were buying about $20 billion a year. President Trump saying he expects that to hit as much as $50 billion a year. The Chinese putting a bit of a caveat on that, saying that will have to be under WTO rules and, of course, if markets allow. So there's some questions there. The second big element here is some commitments from the Chinese on a few structural changes. Intellectual property enforcement, they're going to do more of it, they say. That's something they're doing already. The third big element is something on currency. The Chinese have long been accused of being a currency manipulator. In this agreement, they agreed to be more transparent about how they manage their currency. We'll see what happens there. And the fourth element, and this may be the biggest for the U.S. economy, and it comes from the U.S. side, is that President Trump has agreed not to go ahead with tariffs on $160 billion in imports from China that were due to go into effect on Sunday. He has also agreed to lower the rate on about $110 billion in imports from China that took effect September 1. That'll go down from 15 to 7.5% immediately. Those are all big carrots for the Chinese. This is really the first time we've seen President Trump, who has called himself tariff man, roll back any tariffs. And that's a pretty big confidence building measure here. The big problem with this agreement, and we're already seeing folks point to it, including Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, and that is that this does not address some of the big, long-standing American complaints about the Chinese economy, and that is things like industrial subsidies. President Trump says the tariffs that are still in place will give him the leverage for a Phase 2 of the negotiations, but we don't know when that Phase 2 is going to start. And we have a lot of folks telling us that they don't expect that Phase 2 to conclude any time before the 2020 election.
Well, and that is the question, certainly when you get to politics. Are we going to be going into a presidential election where we're daily getting tweets up and down about what's going on with the Chinese? We've had it now for well over a year. Is this going to keep going through the election?
Yeah, I think we should expect these Phase 2 negotiations, and there may even be a Phase 3 to go on over the next year. I mean, in some ways, what this allows President Trump to do is to say, hey, my tariffs worked, I got a deal. He's also reducing some of the harm caused by his trade wars by getting the Chinese to again buy agricultural goods from U.S. farmers who got hit hard here. And those farmers are in states that he needs for re-election. And at the same time, he gets to address the China hawks by saying, I'm not done yet. I've still got tariffs in place, and there's more negotiating I'm doing. The Chinese are going to have to give more.
Sean, come back to the issue that was so important to the Chinese, that is a rollback on tariffs. As you said, we're not going to get the new tariffs December 15. We're going to roll back the ones from September 1 to 7.5%, not to 0 to 7.5%. When the Chinese say there will be phases in which we'll be rolling back tariffs, does that go beyond the September 1 tariffs?
Yeah, that's unclear right now. That's something that we're trying to nail down here in the U.S. We have not heard that from the U.S. side, but the Chinese very clearly today indicated that they expect more tariffs to come off.
At the same time, the Chinese also, in their news conference over in Beijing, seem to sidestep the question of exactly how much agricultural their projects are going to be buying. Do they buy them irrespective of whether they're cheaper or more expensive than, for example, soybeans from Brazil or Argentina?
Well, that's a big question going forward. We know that the Chinese throughout these talks have been reluctant to commit to a specific number. You saw a sign of that. Part of the question is that they can't go, they can't go any further.
Only one person in the world I'd interrupt you for, and that's the President of the United States. Let's listen to what he said a short time ago.
Big untapped market of 1.5 billion people. And so I was actually doing the finals, but I got to see enough of it. And certainly I spoke to my people. It's a witch hunt. It's a sham. It's a hoax. Nothing was done wrong. Zero was done wrong. I think it's a horrible thing to be using the tool of impeachment, which is supposed to be used in an emergency, and it would seem many, many, many years apart, to be using this for a perfect phone call where the president of that country said there was no pressure whatsoever, didn't even know what we were talking about. It was perfect. The relationship is perfect. I've done much more for them than Obama did for them. It's a scam. It's something that shouldn't be allowed, and it's a very bad thing for our country. And you're trivializing impeachment. And I tell you what, someday there'll be a Democrat president and there'll be a Republican House, and I suspect they're going to remember it. Because when you use impeachment for absolutely nothing other than to try and get political gain. Now, with that being said, my poll numbers, as you know, have gone through the roof. Fundraising for the Republican Party has gone through the roof. We're setting records. Nobody's ever seen anything like it, because the people are disgusted. The people are absolutely disgusted. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. And I watched yesterday, I got to see quite a bit of it yesterday, and I watched these Democrats on the committee make fools out of themselves, absolute fools out of themselves. And I also saw them quoting all the time incorrectly. They kept saying me. It wasn't about me, it was about us. The word was us. So they kept saying me. It said us. Can you do us a favor? Our country, comma, our country. Then it talked about seeing the Attorney General of the United States. For these people to say me, they would say me. You said, do me a favor. No, it didn't say that. It said, do us a favor, our country. Talking about the past election, talking about corruption. The other thing nobody remembers and nobody likes to talk about, and I talk about it all the time, is why isn't Germany, why isn't France, why aren't other European countries paying? Because we're paying the suckers. You know, for years we've been the suckers, but we're not the suckers anymore. Big difference. But why isn't Germany paying big money? They're the ones, I mean, they have a much bigger benefit than we do, because Ukraine is really a stoppage between Russia and parts of Europe, the major part of Europe. Why aren't European countries paying? Why isn't France paying a lot of money? Why is it always the United States? We're 7,000 miles away. Why is it always the suckers that pay? So we've changed that, but nobody brings that up. I think that the whole impeachment thing, hoax, I guess you could call it, because it is a hoax, and Nancy Pelosi knows it. By the way, they duped her yesterday. She was on an interview, and she said, we've been working on this for 2.5 years. So she was working on it, in other words, 2 years before we ever spoke to Ukraine. She said, we've been working on impeachment for 2.5 years. And the reporter was shocked when they got this answer, because it showed she's a liar. So it's a very sad thing for our country, but it seems to be very good for me politically. And again, those people, because I watch some of the dishonest fake media, they're saying, well, the polls have remained the same. No, the polls have not remained the same. I think you understand that, John. The polls have gone through the roof for Trump, because people, especially with independent voters, and especially in swing states, I could show you numbers that nobody has ever seen numbers like this before. So the impeachment is a hoax. It's a sham. It started a long time ago, probably before I came down the escalator with the future First Lady. It started a long time ago. And when you look at the IG report and you look at these horrible FBI people talking about we got to get them out, insurance policies. You know, the insurance policy is just in case she loses, meaning Crooked Hillary, who's crooked as a $3 bill. Just in case Crooked Hillary loses, we've got an insurance policy. Well, we've been going through the insurance policy now for 3 years, and it's a disgrace. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Say it. I think they'll hit $50 billion in agriculture. No, much more than 50, because it's also manufacturing and other. But I think in agriculture they will hit $50 billion.
Next year, or when? What's the
Pretty soon. They've already stepped it up. My deal with them was 2 months ago. We had it in pretty good form. I said, do me a favor, start buying agriculture. And they started. If you look, I mean, they're already buying. Even before the deal is signed, they're buying.
Do you prefer a short?
Mr. President.
Well, we're with the people of Venezuela 100%. It's so important to us, and we're going to be discussing Venezuela today. It'll be a big subject.
Mr. President, do you prefer a short process in the Senate or a more extended process?
Well, I've heard Lindsey Graham, who's terrific, and I heard his statement, and I like that. And I'll do whatever I want. Look, we did nothing wrong. So I'll do long or short. I've heard Mitch, I've heard Lindsey. I think they are very much in agreement on some concept. I'll do whatever they want to do. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't mind a long process because I'd like to see the whistleblower, who's a fraud. The whistleblower wrote a false report. And I really blew it up when I released the transcript of the call. And then Schiff gets up, and I blew him up too, because he went up in front of Congress and he made a statement about what I said that was totally false. And then a long time after he made it, when he got caught, he said, that was parody. No, Schiff is a crooked, he's a corrupt politician and a disgrace. And because of the fact he's in Congress, he's got immunity, so you can't do anything. But he went up there, you know that, he made a totally false statement. The whistleblower wrote a totally false statement. So it's a fraud. Then I say, where is the informer, the one that informed the whistleblower? You had an informer. He disappeared. You know why he disappeared? Because I released the transcript. Had I not released that transcript, we would have had an informer. We would have had another whistleblower. By the way, where's the second whistleblower? Remember that? We have a second whistleblower. We have breaking news. Look, not all of it, but much of the media is corrupt. These are bad people, they're sick people, and they're corrupt. And we're fighting the Democrats, and we're fighting a lot of the corrupt media. But I asked the corrupt media, where's the second whistleblower? Now, had I not had a transcript, I'm lucky we had this transcript, which, by the way, has now been verified by the lieutenant colonel, okay? He's another beauty. So where is all of the stuff that was going to happen? Once I released it, and I released it quickly, but once I released it, all of a sudden, the second whistleblower disappeared. The first whistleblower, who was all set to testify, all of a sudden, he becomes this saint-like figure that they don't need him anymore. The one that everybody wanted to see, including Schiff, was the whistleblower. Once I released the text of what happened, the transcript, that was the end. Everybody disappeared. So now there's no informer. There's no second whistleblower. Everybody's gone. And by the way, a guy like Sondland, nobody ever says it. He said very strongly that I said, I want nothing and no quid pro quo. Nobody says that. That's what he said. He said it in Congress. Nobody ever says that. So look, we're dealing with a lot of corrupt people. There was nothing done wrong. To use the power of impeachment on this nonsense is an embarrassment to this country. The president just said it. It's an embarrassment to our country. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Let's go.
I think that the whole impeachment thing, hoax, I guess you could call it, because it is a hoax, and Nancy Pelosi knows it. By the way, they duped her yesterday. She was on an interview, and she said, we've been working on this for 2.5 years.
Okay, we've been listening to a playback of what President Trump said in the Oval Office a short time ago. He is actually having a visit from the president of Paraguay. That didn't come up in what we heard there. You heard he spent an awful lot of time on his view about the impeachment proceedings up on the Hill. We'll come back to that later on in the program, calling it a farce and a hoax. But in there was a kernel about trade. And for that, we want to go back to Sean Donnan now, who has been patiently waiting for us in Washington. So, Sean, he did say we're going to get to $50 billion, as I understood it, in agriculture alone, manufacturing beyond that, and we'll do it fairly soon. When we finally see the language, will it specify, in your opinion, will it specify when we get to that number? And what about those WTO restrictions and market conditions that you referred to before we heard from the president?
Well, look, you're asking all the right questions there, and we don't have answers to them right now. We know that we're going to get this text that hopefully will give us more detail on what's there. But I think what we're really seeing here from the president is how he is consumed by some of the other news here in Washington right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean, for being with us and for your patience today. That's Bloomberg's Sean Donnan, who covers trade for us in Washington. Now we want to turn from trade to that other big story today. That is, of course, the British elections. Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party yesterday won its biggest majority since the days of Maggie Thatcher. Welcome now from Washington, Heather Conley. She's director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So once again, thank you for your patience, Heather. Let's get to this British election. And this is obviously a massive victory, as I say, an historic victory in many respects. Why did Boris Johnson and the Conservatives do so well? Was it Brexit, or was it the underlying merits of the policies being exposed?
Well, I think in some ways Boris Johnson implemented the keep it simple, stupid theme of just keep it focused on getting Brexit done. It was simple, it was focused. He tried to stay out of controversy. He was very uncharacteristically disciplined in his approach. And it was very clear it was a winning message. I think the other part of the story is the deep, deep unpopularity of Jeremy Corbyn, which also played through in the exit polling data. So you're absolutely right, a historic vote where we were seeing constituencies that have been in Labour's hands for generations turn for the very first time towards the Conservative Party. And so now this domination of the Conservative Party, as I like to always use Colin Powell's phrase, the Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you own it. Well, the Conservative Party has certainly will bring the UK out of the EU, but now they're going to own that process. There's no Parliament to blame. Their dominance gives them a lot of ownership of what comes next.
And the question of what comes next, they can get out. The question is, what are the relationships with Europe after they get out? Do we have any indication of what Boris Johnson is likely to do? Is he likely to go the way of Norway and have rules that are very similar to Europe, so they have really strong trading relationships? Or might he actually risk, I think, the UK economy by really having a more clean break?
So this is absolutely the question, because we have no idea what leader Boris Johnson is going to be. Is he going to be sort of that mayor of London, that liberal centrist who, as he said today, wants a very close partnership with Europe after the UK leaves? Or is he the Boris Johnson that was prime minister for the last 5 months, calling for great divergence from the EU, wanting to be a Singapore on Thames, wanting to compete with the EU across the board? And so we simply don't know. With this majority, he can do all different things that he wants to, but we know the clock is running. So they basically have 11 months to conclude this free trade agreement with the EU, unless Mr. Johnson asks for an extension by the July 1st, and he's told us on the campaign trail he won't do it, but we know that he changes his mind, so we'll have to see.
Yeah, something about dead in a ditch, as I recall. Okay, thank you so much to Heather Conley. She is Senior Vice President and Director of the Europe program at CSIS down in Washington. Coming up here, it's official. Impeachment is heading to a floor vote in the House next week, with a Senate trial looking set for January. We ask our political panel what it all means. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The House Judiciary Committee passed 2 articles of impeachment on a party line vote earlier today, advancing them to the full House for a vote next week. We welcome now our political panel. From Washington, Joel Payne. He's former senior advisor to the Hillary Clinton 2016 presidential campaign. And from Austin, Jason Johnson. He is former chief advisor to the Ted Cruz 2016 presidential campaign. So welcome to both of you. Good to have you here. We just heard at some length from the president. Jason, I can start with you on this, about what he saw yesterday, the way he described it. He called it a farce, a hoax with respect to impeachment. He said they misquoted him, and in fact, they've been planning on this for some good time. Is that basically his defense, insofar as he needs a defense and it goes to trial?
Yeah, I believe it is. I mean, if we step back and really set the partisan rhetoric aside, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, the reality is that it was the worst kept secret in Washington, D.C., that pretty much from day one, at least some in the Democrat Party wanted to impeach this president. And so it's been going on a long time. And unfortunately, it has become simply a partisan affair. We know that the vote to open the inquiry into impeachment was partisan in favor and bipartisan against. And we assume go forward with the next vote on the articles of impeachment in the House, the vote will be the same. And so I think that this president and Republicans at large, and if you look at polling data, when you set the partisans on the right and left aside, the reality is independents have turned against this process because it has been so partisan. And really, it should feel historic, but it doesn't, because it's not historic when you know it's coming.
Right. So, Joel, what about it? I must say this reminds me a little bit of the Clinton impeachment, where basically the Democrats then were saying it's a vast right-wing conspiracy. You've been after the president. And they had a point. They've been after the president. But so that's not entirely surprising. The question is, isn't it, whether the president did anything he should not have done?
Yeah, I mean, look, the only thing historic about it is the levels of support, which are historically high for this type of action. I mean, you look at Clinton and the Clinton impeachment, the country was about 15 to 20 points behind where it is right now in terms of what they think Congress should do, whether they think Congress should move forward with the inquiry and actually impeach the president or not. And I think it's interesting the framing that Jason puts on it when he talks about how this is a partisan affair, when all of the witnesses that Adam Schiff put in front of his Intelligence Committee, those are all Republican appointees. This is not the advisory board of the Democratic National Committee. These aren't my buddies on a text chain, me as part of the professional left, right? These are career Republicans. These are career officials. These are members of our national security apparatus who raised a lot of alarms about the president's behavior. And that's the part that I think Republicans don't want to talk about. And ultimately, that's why the American public is historically supporting impeachment at levels that we haven't seen before.
So Jason, how long should this take, the trial in the Senate? We're assuming now it's going to happen at least. And we're hearing there's a tension between Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, and the White House on how long it should take. We talked to Senator Kramer yesterday from North Dakota, and this is what he said on the subject.
I don't think we ought to aim for a big, long trial. As much fun as it might be to call witnesses that provide exculpatory evidence and testimony for our president, we could hear their evidence and we could hear the rebuttal by the president's lawyers, I think, and go right to a vote on both articles.
So, Jason, if Mitch McConnell has the votes and he thinks he does have the vote, isn't there something you said for just getting the vote taken before something else might develop? You never know what's around the corner.
Certainly, there is. I mean, in reality, if politics were not involved, given the way this is developed in the House, coming to the Senate, giving, again, regardless of what you think about the matter, the votes are very predictable in the Senate. You would just get it out of the way. But I do believe there is a difference of opinion, which is all driven by different views of politics about what, I mean, this is a PR battle. Let's be real. That's what most of this has been about with this trial, you know, quote unquote, on TV in the House. And so there definitely are a lot of Republicans that believe that there should be given ample time in the Senate, and that will help the president and help Republicans to expose the view that this was all a sham from day one.
Okay, many thanks to Joel Payne in Washington. Sorry, Joel, I wanted one more to you, but I just ran out of time. My fault. And also to Jason Johnson down in Austin, Texas. Up next, it's a big day for U.S.-China trade relations, even if we don't yet know just how big it may be or exactly what the parties have agreed to. We're going to talk with Carla Hills, the person we most would want to talk about today, and that is former United States Trade Representative. And she was represented under George Herbert Walker Bush. We're going to ask for her views on where things stand with China and what comes next. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, now it's up to the full House of Representatives to decide whether to impeach President Trump. On a party line vote, the House Judiciary Committee today approved the 2 articles of impeachment. They accuse the president of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The Democratic-controlled House is expected to make Mr. Trump only the 3rd president in U.S. history to be impeached. Still, it's all but certain he'll be acquitted in the Republican-controlled Senate. China and the United States have agreed on the text of a Phase 1 trade deal. The agreement will lead to the removal of tariffs on Chinese goods in stages. In return, China will increase imports from the U.S. At a news conference in Beijing, Chinese officials said the benefits of the deal will be felt around the world.
Given the downward pressure on the world economy, the agreement will also help to boost global market confidence, stabilize market expectations, and create a sound environment for normal economic trade and investment activities.
And on Twitter, President Trump called it, quote, an amazing deal for all. Boris Johnson has redrawn the political map of Britain. An overwhelming election victory by the Conservatives has given the Prime Minister the mandate he needs for Brexit. The party won its biggest majority since 1987 under Margaret Thatcher. The opposition Labour Party took a beating. The party's leader, Jeremy Corbyn, says he will stand down. In India, violent protests continue over a new citizenship law. Police shot and killed 2 demonstrators who broke curfew in the northeastern state of Assam. Thousands of people started fires and blocked streets. The country's new law bars undocumented Muslims from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan from seeking citizenship, while allowing their counterparts from other religions to do so. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Carla Hills served in the cabinets of 2 different Republican presidents as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and then as United States Trade Representative under President George Herbert Walker Bush. Welcome her now back to Bloomberg, joining us from Washington. So welcome, Madam Ambassador. Great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure.
We have this report now. We have the Chinese version. We have some tweets out of President Trump. We haven't seen the text. But from what we've heard so far, it appears that we won't go forward with the new tariffs December 15. We'll reduce to 7.5% the tariffs that were put on September 1, and maybe some more phase down of tariffs going forward. From your point of view, does that make sense to try to hold the Chinese to their bargain and make sure that they do whatever they say they're going to do?
I can't argue with having some kind of leverage. My whole approach toward the Chinese would have been quite different. I would have worked with my allies. But I think that reducing the tariffs, which is really hurting our businesses and our farmers and our workers, is going in the right direction. It is something that we have really suffered from if you look at the statistics.
At the same time, we just heard from the president in the Oval Office. He was meeting with the Paraguayan president. We addressed trade, and he said we're going to have at least $50 billion a year in Chinese purchases of agricultural products from the United States. Does that, to some extent, vindicate the president's approach? That sounds like a pretty good concession to the United States.
Well, I haven't read the agreement. It would be extraordinary to have a $50 billion commitment up front on, but you could get there if you go beyond agriculture and have equipment, manufacturing, and so forth. It could elicit some complaints from our allies who say, that's breaching your national treatment and non-discrimination commitments that you complain about. But let's see. I don't want to complain about the agreement until I have had a chance to read it.
Yeah, well, that certainly is fair. But address one thing I suspect you do know about. The Chinese, when they're addressing this in their news conference, said, OK, we're going to increase our agricultural purchases, no question, subject to WTO provisions and subject also to the marketplace. Explain how that might limit, perhaps, what the Chinese could buy from us.
Well, they're going to have to make a decision. They have been, historically, our largest purchaser of soybeans. So if they go back to their top purchases, that will be a good thing. I think we are super competitive. But let's see how it works out. I think that to the extent that we are trying to drive China to adopt market principles, to abide by national treatment and non-discrimination, we need to fashion our partial agreement to be compliant also.
We're speaking with former U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Carla Hills. And Ambassador Hills, you mentioned earlier the need to have allies in. Thus far, we've done this bilaterally. But this is a so-called phase one. There's a phase two. There maybe there's a phase three. As we go forward to what may be more difficult issues, intellectual property issues, issues of subsidies from the government to industry, is it all the more important in that situation to have the allies?
Well, I think that, you stand in front of China with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and really a total of more than 60% of global GDP, and say, these are the things we need to have fixed. Give us a blueprint of how you're going to address them. You committed to do these things in 2001, and I think we would have far more leverage with far less pain than by relying on unilateral tariffs.
If you were back in your old position and you were advising the President of the United States today, what would you tell him is the realistic expectations? Let's just pick one in particular, subsidies. China has a very differently structured economy than the United States or the West, for that matter. This is sort of essential to a state-run economy. What's realistic to get them to concede? They're not going to throw away their state-run economy, presumably.
Well, they are trying to go more toward the market. And we do business with other countries that have state-owned enterprises. In fact, we do. CalPERS in California is a state-owned enterprise. Singapore has a number of very large state-owned enterprises. The difference is there's no discrimination. Germany has a number, and over the years it has, if it gives subsidies to a specific sector that the state-owned enterprise is involved in, they do not discriminate against giving them to others.
So the markets have been reacting up and maybe down a little bit to this news. As you say, quite correctly, we haven't seen the language yet. We need to see the language. But just preliminarily, how should the markets be reacting? Is this good news for the U.S. industry, for U.S. economy?
To the extent that we pull back on our tariffs, it is good news. To the extent that we're moving forward, even if it's a small step, toward eliminating the trade war, it's going in the right direction. Let's hope that we can take many steps, get to the end where we can work with China on the issues that we share, and it will require the energies of the two largest economies.
Okay, thank you so very much. Former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills will be staying with us now as we turn from U.S.-China trade issues to the USMCA, that replacement for NAFTA. Live from New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
We're talking about 12 million American jobs, about $1.2 trillion for the American people. My home state of Texas, Mexico is the largest trading partner, and it's about 1 million jobs for Texas and about $137 billion. So this is, a lot's been made about giving the president a political win. I would argue this is not, shouldn't be held hostage by politics. This is a win for the American worker.
That was ranking member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Congressman Michael McCall of Texas, talking to Balance of Power just yesterday. Former United States Trade Representative Carla Hills is still with us. So, Madam Ambassador, is this big a victory, the new revised USMCA for the American worker, as Representative McCall suggested?
I think it is a step forward. There are things in it that I would not have preferred to have in it, but we have a very strong relationship with our northern and our southern neighbors. He said 12 million jobs. I've seen calculations up to 14 million jobs of our interregional employment that comes from our trade with Canada and Mexico. And so getting over the trade war, upgrading the North American Free Trade Agreement and moving forward is, in my view, a plus.
A step forward, a plus, but I want to be careful here when we talk about 12, 14 million jobs. Is that incremental over NAFTA because USMCA is so much better, or is that the alternative maybe losing NAFTA?
That's the alternative to losing NAFTA. If you look back at what NAFTA accomplished, it created the most competitive region in the world. And we not only make things together, we really work on strategic things together. And we have high employment because of our integrated supply chains. We have lots of tourists and benefits that come from that. And we forget that Canada and Mexico, we sell a third of our global trade to those two alone. It's an important trade partnership.
Yeah, it's really important to remember exactly that. It took the better part of a year to get this through Congress. It isn't through Congress yet, but at least to an agreement that looks like it will pass through Congress in the new year. Were the changes made at the behest of the Democrats that significant? I mean, for example, take the labor issues. Those were in the agreement. The question was enforcement, an arbitration panel to enforce them. Was that a significant step forward in your judgment?
Well, the things we've imposed upon the auto industry, for example, we boosted up the rules of origin from 62.5% to 75%. That's going to be a little hard for small and medium-sized businesses that make parts for autos. And then we have said that the producers on autos must pay $16 an hour to their workers. To calculate that, some of our entrepreneurs may just say, that's just too much trouble. I'd rather just pay the 2.5% WTO tariff than to have to incur the costs. But this is what we have in the agreement, and I think that having the USMCA is far, far better than not having any agreement at all.
Ambassador Carla Hills, let's look forward a little bit, because as I understand, some of the provisions negotiated in USMCA were borrowed perhaps from the TPP, the deal that we stepped away from under President Trump with the Pacific. Are there things in the USMCA that could be a blueprint for future trade deals the United States does around the world?
Well, you put your finger on it. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a template for upgrading and modernizing the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we put it into the USMCA. I think others will begin to think about, how do we do with that? What do we do with digital flows? How do we enforce the new technology that we have today that we didn't have 25 years ago? And so that's definitely a plus.
Okay, many thanks, Ambassador. Really good to have you with us. That's former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills. And we're going to have more with her coming up at 1 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time in our second hour on radio. Coming up, the United States Senate is moving towards sanctions on both Russia and Turkey, whose two leaders appear to be moving closer to one another. We talk with experts in both countries. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. Relations between Turkey and Russia have not always been easy through the years, but Presidents Putin and Erdogan seem to be putting much of that behind them, even as the United States takes actions against both, albeit for quite different reasons. Welcome now Russian expert Nina Khushova. She is professor of international affairs at the New School here in New York, the author of the book In Putin's Footsteps. And from Washington, Amanda Sloat. She is Robert Bosch Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. So welcome to both of you. First of all, Professor Khushova, let's start with you about exactly what Vladimir Putin appears to be doing with respect to President Erdogan. They seem to be getting quite close after Turkey shot down one of their MiGs.
Well, that was already 4 years ago, and we know that now politics moves very quickly and international affairs move very quickly. So they've become actually bosom friends right after that, because Erdogan originally was very kind of boastful about his shooting down the plane and saying that Turkey has its own policy in Syria, which is completely different from the Russians. And Putin cleverly immediately stopped trade, immediately stopped tourism, which of course Turkey relied on quite a bit in their economy. And 4 years from now, I think this year they already met about 5 times. They've been complimenting each other. They call each other bosom friends. I think Erdogan came out just recently and said that he and Putin are elder statesmen. But a lot of it also is selling of military equipment to Turkey, and Putin certainly is working hard to make that happen.
Yeah, we should go back to that, particularly the S-400. But Amanda, let's turn to you. It's pretty clear, at least to me, what is in it for President Putin. He can sort of peel off, as it were, Turkey from NATO and from a U.S. alliance there. What's in it for Turkey? Why does President Erdogan benefit from this?
So Turkey has had a number of frustrations with the United States, the European Union, and NATO over the last number of years. President Erdogan was very frustrated that the United States and the European Union were quite slow to respond to the coup attempt against him in July of 2016, whereas Russian President Putin reached out much more quickly. He's also been extremely frustrated with the United States for supporting a faction of Kurds in Syria in the fight against the Islamic State that are aligned with the PKK, a domestic terrorist organization. It's also been clear that Russia has played a much more active role on the ground militarily in Syria, and so given Erdogan's own objectives in Syria, it's been in his interest to align himself more closely with the Russians than with the Americans. That said, I don't think Erdogan is wanting to shift entirely towards the Russians, but there is an element of trying to work it with both sides.
Professor Shirova, you mentioned military sales. Let's talk about the S-400s, that missile system that now apparently they're testing in Turkey, right, which has really gone crosswise of President Trump and the United States, particularly the Senate up on the Hill. How important is that? How big a factor is that in the military sales going on? Or is it a lot more than just the S-400s?
Well, it is important just because, of course, Russia wants to show off its very important weapons, but also Erdogan does need Putin in a sense that they both now essentially control Syria because they are in charge of peacemaking. They're in charge of where Assad goes or doesn't go and whatnot. And this is something that important both for Putin and Erdogan, not only with military equipment and military sales and military buying equipment, but also their role in the region. Because Erdogan with S-400s, he now has something that gives him leverage in the region. And I think in this sense, the United States probably didn't play their cards very well because they had options with the Patriots, but they didn't do as much as Erdogan wanted. And of course, you know, there's always a seller, there's always a buyer, and that's how Putin and Erdogan new friendship really has blossomed.
Yeah, we're talking with Nina Khrushcheva of the New School and also Amanda Sloat of Brookings down in Washington. And Amanda, let's come back to you for a moment. As Nina Khrushcheva says, Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Putin seem to now control, pretty much run Syria. They haven't always agreed on things like Mr. Assad. They've sometimes been at daggers drawn.
That's the interesting thing when you look at their relationship. They're actually on opposite sides of the Syrian conflict. The Russians have come in and supported the Assad regime, essentially leading them to military victory within the country, whereas Erdogan's objective from the beginning has been to see Assad leave. So they were at odds on that. And they've also had different perspectives on supporting this faction of Syrian Kurds that I mentioned earlier. While the United States worked with them in Syria, Russia has also worked with them, and yet Turkey has not had the same pushback against Russia that it has against the United States. But certainly, given Trump's decision to largely pull out U.S. troops, Russia's very active presence on the ground, and Turkey's desire to go after the Kurds that it sees as threatening, Erdogan has seen it as much more useful to ally himself with Putin in Syria.
Professor Khrushcheva, whatever one thinks of Vladimir Putin, one has to respect him as a tactician. He sees opportunities, he goes for them.
Absolutely.
Maybe from his training in
judo.
Judo, exactly
Absolutely.
right. He learned it from there. But did he see an opportunity, do you believe, when President Trump came out with America First? America First around the world. He says it's America First. If it's America First, it makes it more difficult to keep allies.
Well, it is, but also I think it has been, I mean, President Trump didn't invent it because there's all these countries that have been going on and saying our national identity is more important. If we look even within European Union, we look at Hungary, Viktor Orban does the same thing. So President Erdogan was doing Turkey first before Trump was doing America first. So in some ways, it is very convenient narrative on Trump's part, but also I think what's important to understand that America really has difficulty in having more than two colors, black and white, so it's either with us or against us. And Erdogan and Putin are really playing chess in this. So something, you give some, you take some. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, but we are tactically have relationship with each other. And unfortunately, unless the United States starts catching up on tactics, it's going to be in disadvantage.
Well, and Amanda Sloat, catching up on tactics doesn't sound consistent with imposing new sanctions against Turkey, Russia as well, but sanctions against Turkey in particular, if we want to develop more closer relationship. At the same time, do we have any choice but to do something, particularly, for example, the S-400, which, as I understand, has really interfered with our use of the F-35 in the region?
Policymaking in Washington is very complicated right now across a number of issues, but particularly on Turkey. You have the administration, including the State Department and the Pentagon, that have been trying to preserve good relations with Turkey while still recognizing that there need to be consequences for problematic behavior. Congress over the last couple of years has gotten incredibly frustrated with Turkey, and you've really seen that rise over its decision to imprison Pastor Andrew Brunson last year, its purchase of the Russian S-400s, and then most recently with its incursion into Syria. Yet Turkey has been shielded from American sanctions by President Trump, given his very personal relationship with Erdogan, and so has not imposed these CAATSA sanctions that Turkey should face for having purchased Russian military equipment, and has not gone forward on a number of sanctions. And so I think you're going to see increasing congressional pressure, as you did with some of the measures that were passed this week, to send a signal to both Erdogan as well as Trump.
You know, policymaking in Washington, fairly complicated. I think that's a fair statement, understatement maybe. Many thanks to Nina Khrushcheva of the New School and Amanda Sloat of Brookings. Great to have you both with us. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll have more with former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills, plus former Southern District of New York Prosecutor Jessica Roth on impeachment. That's coming up on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.